The anesthesia mask was still warm on my face when I heard my daughter-in-law, Olivia, whisper to the nurse, "How long before she wakes up? We need to get the realtor over there today." I should have been unconscious, but something in her voice, that sugar-sweet tone she used when she wanted something, cut through the medication like a blade. The cardiac surgery had gone well, they said, but my heart was breaking all over again as I lay there, eyes closed, listening to my son Matt murmur his agreement. "Mom's too old to handle that big house anyway. This is really for her own good. For her own good." The phrase echoed in my mind as I drifted back under, but not before I heard Olivia add, "The realtor says we can close in 2 weeks if we price it right. She'll never need to know we got less than market value. She's not exactly sharp about these things anymore." The audacity of it all didn't hit me until 3 days later when I was finally alert enough to process what I'd heard. Here I was, 72 years old, recovering from major surgery, and my own family was selling my house out from under me while I couldn't even sit up without help. The house I'd lived in for 43 years, where I'd raised Matt and his sister Rosette, where I'd nursed my husband Thomas through his final illness, where every room held memories they couldn't begin to understand. But what they really couldn't understand was that I'd been managing real estate investments since before Olivia was born. They saw an elderly woman who needed help with her checkbook, but I'd been quietly building a portfolio that would have impressed their financial advisor, if they'd bothered to ask about my finances instead of just assuming I was helpless. The irony was delicious, really, when I thought about it with enough distance to appreciate the cosmic joke of it all. Here was Olivia, barely 35 years old, working part-time at a boutique and spending her days planning elaborate birthday parties for her children and posting carefully curated Instagram photos of her blessed life, trying to manage the finances of a woman who owned more property than Olivia had ever even dreamed of seeing. Here was Matt, my dear boy who'd struggled through community college and landed a middle management position at an insurance company, assuming his mother was too addled to understand the complexities of real estate transactions, when I'd been buying, selling, renovating, and managing rental properties since he was in elementary school. I'd learned early in my marriage that men, even good men like Thomas, sometimes made assumptions about women and money that weren't entirely fair. It wasn't malicious, really. Thomas had been raised in an era where men handled the finances and women handled the household, and despite his generally progressive attitudes, some of those old patterns died hard. So I'd started small, buying a little rental property here and there with money I'd saved from my teaching salary, reinvesting the income, watching the market, learning to read contracts and negotiate deals like my life depended on it. The first property had been almost accidental. I was 29, pregnant with Rosette, and we'd been looking at houses in different neighborhoods when I'd spotted a small duplex with a "for sale by owner" sign in the yard. The asking price seemed low, and when I'd gone to look at it on my own while Thomas was at work, I'd discovered why. The place needed work, but not the kind of expensive structural work that would break the bank. It needed paint and new fixtures and someone willing to spend weekends pulling up old carpet and refinishing hardwood floors. I'd used money from my teaching salary that I'd been saving for someday projects, bought the duplex, and spent my summer vacation turning it into something beautiful. By the time school started in the fall, I had reliable tenants in both units and a monthly income that was almost as much as I made teaching. Thomas had been proud of my little project, as he'd called it, and amazed at how quickly I'd turned it around. But I'd learned something important from that first property. I had an eye for potential that others missed, and I had the patience to do the work that turned potential into profit. More importantly, I discovered that I loved the puzzle of it, finding undervalued properties, seeing what they could become, creating homes that families would be happy to live in while building security for my own family's future. By the time Thomas passed away 5 years ago, I owned 7 rental properties across 3 counties, plus the family home free and clear, and had an investment portfolio that generated more monthly income than Matt made at his middle management job. But to him and Olivia, I was just Mom, the woman who baked cookies for their kids and always had a casserole ready when someone was sick. They saw what they expected to see: a widow living alone in a house too big for her, someone who needed their help and guidance. The irony was that I'd been helping them for years without their knowledge. When Matt's company downsized and he was unemployed for 8 months, the mysterious luck that kept their mortgage current, Olivia thought it was her parents helping out, but it was actually rent money from my downtown duplex. I'd watched my son struggle with the shame of unemployment, seen how it ate at his sense of himself as a provider, and I'd known that offering direct help would have crushed what was left of his pride. So I'd gotten creative. I'd created a shell consulting company and hired Matt to do market research and property evaluations for me. The work was real. I had him drive around looking at potential investment properties, taking photos, researching neighborhood demographics, but I paid him far more than the work was worth because I knew he needed the income and I needed him to feel like he was earning it. To him, it had seemed like a lucky break, a connection through one of my former students who happened to need some part-time help. He'd never suspected that his mother was the client paying his bills. When their youngest needed surgery and their insurance wouldn't cover it all, that billing error that reduced their portion to almost nothing, I'd had a quiet conversation with the hospital's financial coordinator, a woman who'd been my student 30 years ago and still remembered the teacher who'd helped her through her parents' divorce. I'd made an anonymous donation to the hospital's charity care fund, earmarked specifically for pediatric surgery patients with insurance gaps. Little Jenny had gotten her surgery, Matt and Olivia had been spared the financial devastation, and they'd attributed it all to the kindness of bureaucratic strangers. That was how I operated, invisibly, quietly, making sure my family was taken care of without any of them ever knowing where the help was coming from. It preserved their dignity and my privacy, and it allowed me to help without having to listen to Olivia's opinions about how I should be spending my money. Because Olivia had opinions about everything I did, from the clothes I wore to the food I kept in my refrigerator to the way I maintained my house. She'd started making little comments years ago, subtle suggestions that maybe I was getting too old to handle certain things. "Margaret, are you sure you want to be climbing ladders to change those light bulbs? What if you fell?" "Margaret, this house is so big. Don't you think it's a lot of work for someone your age?" "Margaret, are you keeping track of your medications properly? I noticed you seemed confused about what the doctor said at your last appointment." At first, I dismissed it as the natural concern of a daughter-in-law who genuinely cared about my well-being. But over time, the pattern had become clear. Olivia was building a narrative, creating a foundation for the idea that I was declining, that I needed protection from my own poor judgment. She'd started speaking to me like I was a child, using that condescending tone that people reserve for the very young and the very old. She'd begun inserting herself into my affairs without being asked, calling my doctors to check on my care, organizing my calendar because she was worried I might forget important appointments. And I'd let her do it, because it was easier than confronting the uncomfortable truth that my son had married a woman who saw his mother as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. I told myself that her intentions were good, that she was just overly helpful, that she'd grow out of the need to control everyone around her once she matured a little more. Now they wanted to sell my house for my own good. I closed my eyes and let the anger wash over me, clean and pure and clarifying. Not the hot rage that burns out quickly, but the cold fury that plans and calculates and waits for the perfect moment. They thought I was weak, confused, unable to manage my own affairs. They thought they could make decisions about my life while I lay helpless in a hospital bed, drugged and vulnerable, and trusting them to take care of me the way I'd taken care of them for so many years. They were about to learn how catastrophically wrong they were. The first thing I did when I got home from the hospital was call my lawyer, Elizabeth Chen, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd been handling my property investments for the past decade. Elizabeth was the daughter of immigrants, a woman who'd worked her way through law school while raising 2 children as a single mother, and she had absolutely no patience for people who tried to take advantage of others' vulnerabilities. "Elizabeth," I said, settling into my kitchen chair with a cup of tea, my hands still shaking slightly from the combination of medication and pure rage, "I need to ask you about something. Can someone sell a house without the owner's consent?" There was a pause long enough that I could practically hear her lawyer brain kicking into high gear. "Margaret, are you all right? Has someone been pressuring you about your property?" I told her the whole story, from what I'd overheard in the recovery room to the real estate signs that had mysteriously appeared in my front yard while I was still in the hospital. I told her about Olivia's years of subtle undermining, about the pattern of treating me like I was incompetent, about the way they'd used my surgery as an opportunity to take control of my life without my consent. Elizabeth's silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight with the kind of controlled anger that trial lawyers perfect over years of dealing with injustice. "Margaret," she said, each word carefully measured, "what they're attempting is elder abuse and fraud. If they've forged your signature on any documents, it's also identity theft and criminal fraud. Do you want me to contact the authorities immediately?" "Not yet," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. The rage was still there, burning steady and bright, but it was focused now, purposeful. "First, I want to know exactly what they've done. Can you find out if any documents have been filed? Can you trace what steps they've taken?" Elizabeth promised to investigate immediately, and while I waited for her call back, I did some investigating of my own. I called the realtor whose sign was in my yard, a young man named Derek who clearly thought he was dealing with a confused elderly woman who could be managed with the right combination of condescension and false cheer. "Oh, Mrs. Patterson," he said when I introduced myself, his voice immediately taking on that tone people use when they're talking to children or pets. "Don't you worry about a thing. Your family explained that you're not quite yourself after the surgery, and they're handling everything for you. We've already had several very interested buyers, and I think we can get you a quick sale that will take all the stress off your shoulders." "How quick?" I asked, playing up the frail, confused voice they expected to hear, letting my words come out a little slower, a little more uncertain than usual. "Well, we've got a cash offer already, 20% below asking, but your son was very clear that you need the money fast for your care. Sometimes it's better to take a sure thing than to gamble on the market, you know? Especially when there are medical bills and long-term care costs to think about." 20% below asking. On a house worth $600,000, they were willing to let it go for less than $500,000, and I was willing to bet that Matt and Olivia had already figured out how to pocket the difference for my care. The house that I'd bought for $38,000 in 1981 yen, that I'd lovingly maintained and improved over 4 decades, that had appreciated into one of the most valuable properties in the neighborhood. They were planning to sell it at a loss and tell me it was for my own good. I thanked Derek in my sweetest, most confused voice and hung up, then sat in my kitchen looking around at the home I'd lived in for most of my adult life. The kitchen where I'd packed thousands of school lunches, where I'd taught Rosette and Matt to cook, where Thomas and I had shared our morning coffee and planned our days for more than 3 decades. The living room where I'd watched my children take their first steps, where we'd celebrated Christmas mornings and birthday parties, where I'd held Thomas as he grew weaker during those final months of his illness. Every room held layers of memory, decades of life lived fully and completely. The bedroom where both my children had been born during a time when home births were more common, where Thomas and I had whispered about our dreams and fears in the dark hours before dawn, where I'd held him as he took his final breath and promised him I'd be strong enough to handle whatever came next. The basement workshop where he'd taught Matt to use tools and build things with his hands, where I'd set up my first office for managing the rental properties that had become the foundation of our financial security. They wanted to sell all of it so they could buy a bigger house in a better neighborhood. I'd heard Olivia complaining about their current subdivision for months, how it was getting trashy, and how they deserved something better, how Matt worked so hard and should be able to live somewhere that reflected his success. Never mind that Matt's success was largely built on the invisible financial support I'd been providing for years. Never mind that the trashy neighborhood they were so eager to escape was still nicer than the one I'd grown up in, where we'd been grateful to have indoor plumbing and enough bedrooms for the children not to share. What they deserved was a lesson in respect, and I was uniquely positioned to provide it. Elizabeth called back that evening with information that made my blood run cold and my resolve burn even brighter. "They've been busy, Margaret. Someone, and I strongly suspect it's your son, has been to the county recorder's office trying to get copies of your property records. They've also contacted your insurance company asking about your coverage and claiming to be helping you manage your affairs due to cognitive decline." "Cognitive decline, I'm cold," I repeated, my voice sharp despite my efforts to stay calm. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, carrying with it all the implications of what they'd been planning, how long they'd been setting this up. The insurance representative I spoke with said they were very convincing. Apparently, your daughter-in-law was quite emotional about how difficult this has been for the family, having to watch your mental state deteriorate, how worried they were about your ability to make sound financial decisions. I closed my eyes and counted to 10, then 20, then 30. The image that came to me was of Olivia practicing her performance in the mirror, working up tears and perfecting that trembling voice she used when she wanted sympathy. I could see her researching the symptoms of dementia online, learning the right words to use, the right concerns to express, building a case for my incompetence with the same attention to detail she brought to planning her children's birthday parties. "Elizabeth, I want you to do something for me. I want you to prepare documentation proving my mental competency, whatever tests or evaluations are necessary. I want medical records, psychological evaluations, anything that will prove beyond doubt that I'm mentally sharp and capable of making my own decisions. Margaret, I think you should also consider—" I know what you're going to say, but I'm not ready for the authorities yet. First, I want them to show me exactly how far they're willing to go. I want to see the full extent of their betrayal before I decide how to respond to it. It turned out to be further than I'd ever imagined possible. Over the next week, while I was supposedly resting and recovering under Olivia's watchful care, I watched my family systematically dismantle my life with the efficiency of professional thieves. Olivia started coming by every day, ostensibly to help with my recovery, but actually to pack up what she called valuable items for safekeeping. I watched her wrap my grandmother's china in newspaper and carry it out to her car, explaining with that syrupy concern in her voice that it would be safer at her house until I was more settled. My grandmother's silver service followed, then the collection of first edition books that Thomas had given me over the years, then the jewelry that had been my mother's and my grandmother's before that. "We just want to make sure nothing gets damaged or lost during the transition," she said, her voice dripping with false concern as she carefully packed away a necklace that had been in my family for 3 generations. "You know how moving can be so chaotic, and these pieces are irreplaceable. We'll keep them safe until you're established in your new place." My new place. As if it had already been decided, as if my consent was irrelevant to decisions about my own life. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and demand to know who had given her the right to decide where I would live, what I would keep, how my life would be organized. But I held my tongue and played the part of the confused, grateful mother-in-law because I needed to see how far they would go. Matt came by with papers for me to sign, insurance forms, he said, and healthcare directives that would make everything easier for everyone. The documents were thick and full of legal language that he assured me was standard boilerplate, nothing I needed to worry about understanding completely. "Mom, you don't need to read every word of this stuff," he said when I started examining the papers more carefully, his voice taking on that patient tone he used with his children when they were asking too many questions. "This is just standard paperwork that'll help us take care of you better. Elizabeth charges you a fortune just to read things you could handle yourself. And honestly, some of this legal language is confusing even for people who aren't recovering from surgery." But I insisted on having Elizabeth review the documents, and when she did, we discovered they weren't insurance forms at all. They were legal papers attempting to establish a conservatorship based on my supposed mental incapacity and a power of attorney that would give Matt complete control over all my assets, my medical decisions, and essentially every aspect of my life. "They've been planning this for months, maybe years," Elizabeth said during our emergency meeting in her office the next day. "These aren't documents you throw together overnight. Someone's been consulting with a lawyer, probably telling them that you're incompetent and need protection from yourself. The level of detail here suggests they've been building a case for a long time." I thought about all the times in recent months when Olivia had made little comments about my forgetfulness, how she'd started correcting me when I told stories about the past, claiming I was mixing up details or remembering things wrong. I remembered how she'd begun taking over my social calendar, calling my friends to cancel plans because she was concerned about me overextending myself, gradually isolating me from my support network under the guise of protection. She'd been playing a long game, systematically undermining my credibility and my independence, creating a paper trail of concern and intervention that would support their ultimate goal of taking control of my assets. Every conversation where she'd questioned my memory, every time she'd insisted on accompanying me to doctor's appointments, just to make sure I understood everything correctly. Every suggestion that I was getting too old to handle my own affairs, it had all been building toward this moment. "Elizabeth Song," I said, my voice steady despite the fury burning in my chest, "I want to know something. If someone were to attempt to sell property through fraud, what would happen to them legally?" "Criminal charges, certainly. Fraud, elder abuse, possibly identity theft, if they forged signatures. They'd be looking at potential jail time, though more likely probation and community service for first offenders. And they'd be liable for any financial damages, plus legal costs." She looked at me carefully, her dark eyes sharp with understanding. "Margaret, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that they believe I'm a helpless old woman with no resources and no options. I'm thinking they've counted on that belief so completely that they've gotten careless and overconfident." I smiled, probably the first real smile I'd managed in weeks. I'm thinking it's time to show them exactly who they're really dealing with. The plan I came up with was elegant in its simplicity. I would let them proceed with their fraud just far enough to hang themselves legally, then I would spring my trap with the full force of the law behind me. But first, I needed to secure my real assets, the properties and investments they didn't know about, the foundation of wealth they'd never suspected existed. Over the next few days, While Olivia continued her daily visits to help me by systematically looting my home, I quietly moved to protect my true financial empire. I had Elizabeth update all the property deeds to include ironclad clauses that would make any sale null and void without her specific legal approval and my verified consent, witnessed and notarized with full competency documentation. I moved my investment accounts to a new bank that Matt and Olivia had never heard of, one where I'd done business for years through my property management company. I updated all my insurance policies and medical directives to ensure that Elizabeth was my primary contact for any legal issues, and I had my doctor prepare detailed documentation of my mental and physical competency. Most importantly, I did something they would never suspect. I bought a new house. The property was perfect, a beautiful townhome in a gated community about 20 minutes away, with concierge service, maintenance included, and a community center where I could continue the art classes I'd been teaching at the senior center for years. The neighborhood was full of active people my age who were living independent, fulfilling lives, who saw retirement as an opportunity for new adventures rather than a slow decline into helplessness. I paid cash for the townhome using funds from my investment portfolio and arranged for the closing to happen the same week they planned to finalize the sale of my family home. The timing would be crucial. I wanted them to think they'd succeeded right up until the moment their world fell apart. But I wasn't done yet. Through my network of former students and teaching colleagues, connections built over 30 years in the classroom, I learned that Derek the realtor had been bragging around town about his easy commission from the confused old lady whose family was handling everything for her. He'd apparently told several people at the country club that he'd never had a simpler sale, no negotiations, no inspections, no difficult clients asking awkward questions or demanding repairs. "It's like Christmas morning," he'd reportedly said over drinks at the 19th hole. "The old lady doesn't even know what's happening, the family just wants it gone, and I get my commission without having to do any real work. I love these senile old bird deals." Senile old bird. The phrase lodged in my chest like the tip of a needle, sharp and cold and clarifying. That's what I was to him. Not a person with rights and dignity, not a homeowner who'd spent decades building equity and maintaining property, but a senile old bird whose confusion was his good fortune. That's when I decided to attend my own house showing. Olivia had told me that they were having an open house on Saturday, and that I should plan to spend the day at Rosette E's house so I wouldn't be confused and upset by all the strangers walking through my home. Instead, I called my hairdresser and made an appointment for a full styling session. I bought a new outfit that was elegant but not too formal, a navy blue dress that brought out my eyes and a matching jacket that gave me the kind of authority that people instinctively respected. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a competent, successful woman who was nobody's fool. I arrived at my own front door at exactly 2 o'clock, just as the open house was getting busy. Derek didn't recognize me at first. I suppose he'd expected a bathrobe and slippers, maybe a confused expression, and the kind of defeated posture that comes from feeling powerless. Instead, he saw a put-together woman who clearly knew her way around real estate, who moved through the house with the confidence of someone who understood property values and market dynamics. I walked through my home with a group of prospective buyers, listening to Derek's sales pitch with growing amazement at the sheer audacity of his lies. He was standing in my beautifully renovated kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, telling people that the house needed significant updating to meet modern standards. "The owner is elderly and in declining health," he told the group as we stood in my living room, surrounded by the fresh paint and updated fixtures I'd had installed just 2 years earlier. "The family is very motivated to sell quickly so they can get her the care she needs. As you can see, the house needs some updating, but the bones are good and the price reflects the work that needs to be done." Needs updating. I looked around at my recently renovated spaces, my newly refinished hardwood floors, my carefully chosen paint colors and modern fixtures. Either Derek had never actually looked at the house he was selling, or he was deliberately misrepresenting its condition to justify the artificially low price. "The family has priced it to move, Yipses," he continued, his voice taking on the practiced enthusiasm of a man who thought he was addressing buyers too stupid to notice his obvious lies, "and they're willing to consider any reasonable offer below asking. The owner won't be involved in negotiations. She's not really capable of handling complex decisions anymore, so the family has full authority to make whatever deal works best for everyone." Not capable of handling complex decisions. I thought about the 7 properties I owned and managed, the investment portfolio I'd built over decades of careful planning, the rental income I'd been collecting and reinvesting for longer than Derek had been alive. I thought about the financial analysis I did every month, the market research that guided my investment decisions, the complex tax planning that allowed me to maximize my returns while minimizing my liabilities. I waited until he'd finished his presentation, until the prospective buyers had wandered through all the rooms and started heading toward the door, clearly disappointed by the gap between Derek's description and the actual condition of the property. Then I spoke up, using the voice I'd developed through 30 years of commanding attention in high school classrooms. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying the kind of authority that makes people stop talking and listen. "I think there may be some significant confusion here. I'm Margaret Patterson, and this is my house." The silence that followed was deafening. Derek's face went through several interesting color changes, and I could see him trying to process this unexpected development, struggling to figure out how to handle a situation his training had never prepared him for. The prospective buyers stopped in the doorway, sensing drama but not understanding the situation, caught between curiosity and the desire to escape whatever awkward family drama they'd stumbled into. "Mrs. Patterson," Derek said finally, his voice strained and uncertain, "your family said you might be confused about—" "Oh, I'm not confused at all," I interrupted, my voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel that made everyone in the room pay attention. "In fact, I'm very clear about what's happening here. You're attempting to sell my house without my knowledge or consent, based on false claims about my mental state and lies about the property's condition. That's fraud, Mr. Derek." The prospective buyers were staring now, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding as they realized they'd walked into something far more serious than a simple real estate transaction. I could see them exchanging glances, calculating whether they wanted to be involved in whatever legal mess was clearly brewing. I turned to address them directly, my voice taking on the kind of professional courtesy I'd always used with parents during difficult conferences about their children's behavior. "I apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced today, but this house is not actually for sale. There seems to have been a serious misunderstanding about my capacity to make my own decisions and my intentions regarding my property." I looked back at Derek, whose face had gone pale as the implications of the situation began to sink in. "A very serious misunderstanding that I'll be discussing with my attorney and the appropriate authorities." As the buyers filed out, muttering among themselves and shooting curious glances back at the house, Derek tried desperately to salvage the situation. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by the kind of panic that comes from realizing you've stepped in something much deeper than you'd expected. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm sure there's been some kind of miscommunication here. Your son explained that you've been having some memory issues since your surgery, and your daughter-in-law was very clear that the family was acting in your best interests." "My memory is fine," I said, my voice cutting through his stammering with surgical precision. "Fine enough to remember that I never gave anyone permission to sell my house. Fine enough to remember that this is fraud and elder abuse. And certainly fine enough to remember that I have very good lawyers who take these kinds of crimes very seriously." I left Derek standing in my empty living room, his face a mask of confusion and growing dread, and drove home to wait for the phone calls I knew were coming. I didn't have to wait long. Matt called first, his voice tight with anger and embarrassment, the tone of someone who'd been caught doing something wrong and was trying to turn the situation around by making it someone else's fault. "Mom, what the hell did you think you were doing today? Derek called and said you completely sabotaged the open house, confused all the buyers, and made some kind of crazy accusations about fraud. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was?" "Not nearly as embarrassing as what's going to happen to you if you don't stop this nonsense immediately," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system and in the rage that was building to a crescendo in my chest. "Mom, we're trying to help you. You can't live alone anymore, not after the surgery. You need to be somewhere safe, somewhere with people who can take care of you and make sure you're getting proper medical attention." "I am somewhere safe, Matt. I'm in my own home, which is exactly where I belong. And the only people I need protection from, apparently, are my own family." Olivia got on the phone then, and I could practically see her switching into performance mode, her voice taking on that syrupy tone that always set my teeth on edge, the one she used when she was trying to manipulate someone into doing what she wanted. "Margaret, honey, we know this is scary. Change is always scary, especially when we're not feeling our best and everything seems overwhelming. But we love you, and we just want what's best for you. We've been so worried about you living alone in that big house, especially after the surgery showed us how fragile you really are." "What's best for me is to be treated with respect and honesty," I said, each word carefully measured and delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that made my former students sit up and pay attention. What's best for me is not having my family attempt to steal my house while I'm unconscious in a hospital bed. Steal? Olivia's voice went up an octave, taking on the kind of wounded innocence that she'd perfected over the years of our relationship. Margaret, how can you say such a thing? We're trying to help you manage your affairs so you don't have to worry about all these complicated decisions when you're not feeling well. We're trying to make sure you have the money you need for proper care. The only complicated decision I need to make, I said, my voice carrying the full weight of my fury and determination, is whether to have you both arrested for fraud right now or to simply let the county prosecutor handle it when I file my report on Monday morning. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if they'd hung up. When Matt finally spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of patience and concern, revealing the anger and entitlement that had been lurking underneath all along. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. The doctor said that anesthesia can affect older patients' judgment for weeks after surgery. You're obviously confused about what's happening here, and you're making wild accusations that don't make any sense. I'm not confused about anything, I said, my voice growing stronger with every word. I'm not confused about the fact that you tried to sell my house without my permission. I'm not confused about the forged papers you tried to get me to sign. I'm not confused about the fact that you've been telling people I'm mentally incompetent so you could steal my assets. And I'm certainly not confused about the fact that everything you've done constitutes elder abuse and fraud. We haven't stolen anything, Olivia shouted, abandoning her sweet tone entirely and revealing the harsh voice of someone who wasn't used to being challenged. We've been taking care of you, managing your affairs, because you obviously can't handle them yourself anymore. You should be grateful instead of accusing us of crimes we didn't commit. Grateful, I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. You know what I should be grateful for? I should be grateful that I found out who you really are before you succeeded in robbing me blind. I should be grateful that your greed made you impatient and careless. And I should be grateful that I raised my son better than this, even if he seems to have forgotten everything I taught him about right and wrong. I hung up then before they could respond and sat in my kitchen with my hands shaking slightly from anger and adrenaline. But underneath the rage was something else, a cold satisfaction that came from knowing I held all the cards and they didn't even know they were playing a game they'd already lost. Elizabeth called me early Monday morning with news that didn't surprise me, but still made my blood pressure spike. They've moved fast, Margaret. They filed an emergency petition for conservatorship over the weekend. The hearing is scheduled for Wednesday. They're claiming that your behavior at the open house proves you're mentally unstable and possibly dangerous to yourself. Perfect, I said, and I meant it. The word tasted sweet on my tongue, full of the promise of justice finally served. That gives us exactly the time we need to prepare our counterattack. Over the next 2 days, Elizabeth and I worked with the kind of focused intensity that comes from righteous anger combined with professional expertise. We gathered evidence, prepared documentation, and built a case that would not only destroy their petition for conservatorship, but expose the full extent of their attempted fraud. On Tuesday, Elizabeth and I met with Dr. Rosette Martinez, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations and had experience testifying in elder abuse cases. Dr. Martinez was a woman in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that came from decades of working with older adults and their families. She spent 3 hours putting me through every cognitive test she could think of: memory assessments, problem-solving exercises, financial literacy questions, logical reasoning tasks. She tested my ability to understand complex information, make sound judgments, and communicate my decisions clearly. She evaluated my understanding of my own financial situation, my awareness of the legal implications of various decisions, and my capacity to resist undue influence. When she finished, Dr. Martinez looked at me with something like admiration in her eyes. Mrs. Patterson, your test scores are not only within normal ranges for your age group, they're actually above average for adults of any age. Your cognitive function is excellent, your judgment is sound, and your understanding of complex financial and legal matters is frankly impressive. She paused, her expression hardening. If someone is claiming you're incompetent, they're either grossly misinformed or deliberately lying for their own purposes. We also met with my cardiologist, Dr. Robert Kim, who provided comprehensive documentation that my surgery had been successful and that there was no medical reason I couldn't continue living independently for years to come. He was actually somewhat offended by the suggestion that cardiac surgery somehow automatically rendered patients mentally incompetent. Mrs. Patterson is one of my most compliant and engaged patients, he told Elizabeth as he prepared his written statement. She asks intelligent questions about her care, follows all medical instructions precisely, and has shown excellent judgment in managing her recovery. The idea that she's mentally incompetent is not just wrong, it's insulting to every older adult who has the courage to undergo necessary medical treatment. Elizabeth gathered statements from my neighbors, my former colleagues, and the people at the senior center where I taught art classes twice a week. The picture that emerged was of a woman who was not only mentally sharp, but actively engaged in her community, financially sophisticated, and completely capable of managing her own affairs. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived next door and had been my friend for 15 years, provided a particularly damning statement about Olivia's behavior in recent months. She'd witnessed Olivia going through my mail, taking packages from my porch without permission, and telling delivery drivers that she was managing things for her mother-in-law who wasn't competent anymore. She'd also overheard Olivia on the phone multiple times, talking about when the old lady finally goes, and how they were just trying to protect the assets from her poor decisions. But the piece de resistance was the complete financial documentation that Elizabeth had prepared. The numbers were staggering, even to me when I saw them laid out in black and white. 7 rental properties worth a combined total of $2.8 million, an investment portfolio that had grown to just over $1.5 million, the family home valued at $600,000, monthly rental income of $18,000, plus investment returns that varied but averaged another $8,000 per month. The total picture was of a woman with a net worth of nearly $5 million, generating enough monthly income to live comfortably for the rest of her life while continuing to grow her wealth. It was the financial profile of someone who had been making smart, sophisticated investment decisions for decades, not someone who needed protection from her own poor judgment. More importantly, the documentation proved conclusively that I was far more capable of managing complex financial decisions than either Matt or Olivia had ever been. Matt's annual salary was $68,000. Olivia made perhaps $15,000 a year from her part-time job at the boutique. Their combined annual income was less than what I made in 4 months from my investments alone. The conservatorship hearing on Wednesday was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. Matt and Olivia arrived with their lawyer, a tired-looking man named Harold Brennan, who'd clearly been hired based on his low fees rather than his competence or experience with elder law. They'd brought their carefully prepared documentation of my supposed mental decline, including Derek's statement about my confused behavior at the open house, Olivia's tearful written account of how I'd been forgetting things and making poor decisions, and even a statement from one of Olivia's friends who claimed to have witnessed me acting disoriented and paranoid during a recent social gathering. They'd also brought financial records that they claimed proved I was incapable of managing my money, records that showed only the checking and savings accounts they knew about, which held perhaps $50,000 combined. In their narrative, I was a confused elderly woman with limited assets who needed protection from my own declining faculties. Harold Brennan stood up first, presenting their case with the kind of rehearsed sincerity that comes from years of practice but no real conviction. He painted a picture of a loving family trying to protect a vulnerable matriarch who was too proud and confused to accept the help she desperately needed. Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson is a woman of advanced age who has recently undergone major surgery, and the evidence clearly shows that her cognitive abilities have been compromised. The family has tried to help her manage her affairs voluntarily, but she has become increasingly paranoid and hostile, making wild accusations against the very people who are trying to help her. He presented Olivia's statement about my forgetfulness, the incident at the open house where I had disrupted a legitimate real estate transaction with delusional claims, and their assertion that I was no longer capable of understanding the complexities of financial management or medical care decisions. The family is not seeking control for any selfish reasons, Brennan continued, his voice taking on the kind of noble tone that lawyers use when they're trying to disguise a weak case. They simply want to ensure that Mrs. Patterson receives the care she needs and that her limited assets are protected from her own poor judgment. Then Elizabeth stood up, and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. She began by presenting Dr. Martinez's competency evaluation, reading selected portions that made it clear I was not only mentally sharp, but functioning at levels above average for my age group. She followed with Dr. Kim's statement about my excellent recovery and continued capacity for independent living. But then she did something that made Matt and Olivia's faces drain of color. She presented the complete financial documentation. Your Honor, the petitioners have presented a fundamentally false picture of Mrs. Patterson's situation. They claim she has limited assets that need protection, but in fact, Mrs. Patterson has a net worth of approximately $4.9 million and generates over $25,000 per month in passive income from her carefully managed investment portfolio and rental properties. The judge's eyebrows went up sharply, and I saw Harold Brennan turn to stare at his clients with an expression of dawning horror. This was clearly the first time he was hearing about my actual financial situation. Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger as she laid out the evidence. Mrs. Patterson has been successfully managing complex real estate investments for over 4 decades. She owns and operates 7 rental properties across 3 counties, maintains detailed financial records, files appropriate tax returns, and has built this wealth through decades of sound financial planning and investment strategy. She paused to let that sink in, then delivered the killing blow. The petitioners, who claim to be concerned about Mrs. Patterson's ability to manage her finances, have a combined annual income of approximately $83,000. Mrs. Patterson's passive income alone is more than 3 times their total household earnings. She is, by any objective measure, far more financially sophisticated than the people who claim she needs their protection. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. She then presented evidence of Matt and Olivia's attempted fraud, starting with the real estate contract signed without my consent and moving through the forged power of attorney documents, the false statements to insurance companies about my cognitive abilities, and the systematic removal of my personal property under false pretenses. Your Honor, this is not a case of a concerned family trying to help a declining relative. This is a case of attempted elder abuse and fraud, perpetrated by people who assumed their victim was too vulnerable to fight back. The courtroom was dead silent as Elizabeth presented copies of the conservatorship papers, pointing out that they would have given Matt complete control over assets worth nearly $5 million based on the false claim that I had limited assets and declining cognitive abilities. The judge's face grew increasingly stern as Elizabeth presented the evidence, and by the time she finished, Matt and Olivia looked like they wanted to disappear through the floor. Harold Brennan was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly trying to figure out how his clients had failed to mention the small detail of my multi-million-dollar net worth. Mr. Brennan, the judge said, his voice cold with disapproval, are you telling this court that your clients attempted to gain control of a $5 million estate by claiming the owner was mentally incompetent and had limited assets? Brennan tried to salvage the situation by claiming it had all been a misunderstanding, that Matt and Olivia had genuinely believed I needed help and had acted out of love and concern. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear, and the financial motivation too obvious. The judge dismissed their petition for conservatorship with prejudice, meaning they could never file another one based on the same claims. He ordered them to return all of my personal property immediately and to cease any interference with my financial or medical affairs. Most satisfying of all, he referred the case to the county prosecutor for possible criminal charges and warned them that any further attempts to interfere with my autonomy would result in immediate arrest and contempt charges. But the real moment of satisfaction came as we left the courthouse. Matt caught up with me in the parking lot, his face red with anger and humiliation, and when he spoke, his voice was shaking with rage and disbelief. I hope you're happy now, he said, his words coming out in sharp bursts like he could barely control himself. You've humiliated us in front of everyone, made us look like criminals when all we wanted was to help you. You've destroyed our family over money. I stopped walking and looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the successful man he thought he was, but the entitled child who had never learned that other people's assets weren't his to manage. This was my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle and helped with his homework and worried about through every difficult phase of his life, the man I'd secretly supported through his unemployment and his children's medical bills, always from a distance, always preserving his dignity, always making sure he never had to feel like he owed his mother anything. Matt, I said quietly, my voice carrying the weight of 72 years of accumulated wisdom and disappointment. You tried to steal my house while I was unconscious from surgery. You forged legal documents and lied to real estate agents and insurance companies. You told people I was mentally incompetent so you could take control of my assets. If you don't see how that's criminal behavior, then I failed you even more completely than I thought. We were trying to protect you, Olivia screamed, abandoning any pretense of the sweet, concerned daughter-in-law she'd been pretending to be for so many years. You're an old woman living alone in a house too big for you, with more money than you know what to do with. You're a target for every scammer and con artist in the state, and you're too stubborn and proud to admit you need help. You're absolutely right, as I said, and I saw hope flicker in their eyes for just a moment before I continued. I was a target for scammers and con artists, but the people trying to take advantage of me weren't strangers calling on the phone or knocking on my door. They were my own family, the people I trusted most in the world. I turned to walk toward my car, then stopped and looked back at them one more time, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Oh, and Matt, that consulting job you had during your unemployment 8 years ago, the one that paid just enough to keep your mortgage current when Olivia thought her parents were helping out? That was me. I hired you through a shell company because I knew you were too proud to accept help directly, and I couldn't stand to watch you lose your house. I smiled at their shocked faces, taking satisfaction in the way their expressions shifted from anger to confusion to dawning comprehension. I guess my money was good enough for you when you didn't know it was mine. The drive to my new townhome took 25 minutes through tree-lined streets that led to a community where people my age were living independent, active lives, surrounded by beautifully maintained gardens and walking paths, and neighbors who understood that aging didn't automatically mean incompetence or decline. As I pulled into my assigned parking space, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete, unqualified peace. My new home was everything the old house had been, but better, designed for the life I wanted to live now. Not the life I'd lived 40 years ago when I was raising children and managing a household of 4 people. 2 bedrooms instead of 4, so I wasn't rattling around in empty spaces full of memories. An open-concept kitchen perfect for entertaining the friends I was already making in the community. A sunroom where I could paint and read without interruption, with views of gardens that someone else maintained. And best of all, a community of neighbors who saw me as a capable adult with her own interests and opinions, rather than a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved. Elizabeth called that evening to tell me that the prosecutor was moving forward with fraud charges against Matt and Olivia. They're looking at possible jail time for the forgery and attempted fraud, she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a lawyer who just won a case she cared deeply about. Though more realistically, they'll probably get probation and community service if they agree to a plea bargain. The important thing is that they'll have criminal records, and there will be legal documentation of what they tried to do to you. And Derek? I asked, thinking about the realtor who'd been so eager to profit from what he'd assumed was my confusion. Derek has been sanctioned by the real estate board and is facing his own fraud charges for attempting to sell property without proper authorization. His license is probably going to be suspended, and he's looking at both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit. The listing has been canceled, obviously, and any contracts they signed are completely null and void. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Margaret, what do you want to do about the family house? Are you planning to go back, or do you want to put it on the market legitimately? I looked around my new living room with its modern furniture and uncluttered surfaces, its windows that looked out onto gardens that bloomed with flowers I didn't have to plant or tend, walkways I didn't have to shovel or maintain. I thought about the community center where I'd already signed up to teach watercolor classes, the book club I'd been invited to join, the neighbors who'd welcomed me with genuine warmth and interest in who I was rather than assumptions about what I needed. No, I said, the word coming out with surprising finality. I think I'm exactly where I belong now. I put the old house on the market the following month, this time with a reputable realtor who treated me with the respect due to a knowledgeable property owner with decades of real estate experience. The house was professionally photographed and marketed at its true value, with accurate descriptions of its excellent condition and recent improvements. It sold within 2 weeks for $15,000 over the asking price to a young family with 3 children who promised to love it as much as I had. The husband was a teacher, like I'd been, and the wife was starting her own business from home. They had the same kind of dreams and energy that Thomas and I had brought to that house 43 years earlier, and I could see them building the same kind of memories in those rooms that had held our family's life for so long. With the proceeds from the sale, I did something that felt like the perfect capstone to this whole experience. I established a scholarship fund for students pursuing education degrees, with a special emphasis on supporting older women who were returning to school or changing careers later in life. It seemed like a fitting legacy for a teacher who'd learned her most important lesson about standing up for herself at the age of 72. Matt and Olivia ultimately pled guilty to attempted fraud and received 2 years of probation each, plus substantial fines and an order to pay restitution for the legal fees they'd caused me to incur. More importantly, from my perspective, they received a permanent restraining order that prevented them from coming within 500 feet of me or attempting to contact me through third parties. The last I heard, they'd moved to another state, whether from shame, financial necessity after paying their legal bills, or simply the desire to start over where people didn't know about their criminal convictions. I neither knew nor cared. Matt had lost his job at the insurance company when his fraud conviction came to light, and Olivia's boutique had let her go when the story made the local papers. Their children, my grandchildren, were caught in the middle of a situation they didn't understand and couldn't control, which was perhaps the saddest part of the whole mess. Rosette, my daughter who lived across the country, reached out to me after the court case to apologize for not intervening when she'd sensed something was wrong during our phone calls in the months leading up to the surgery. We have lunch via video chat once a month now, and she's been teaching me to use various computer programs so I can manage my investment accounts online and stay in touch with my old friends who've moved to different states. I knew something felt off about the way Olivia was talking about you, she admitted during one of our conversations. The way she'd interrupt when you were telling stories or correct details that didn't seem wrong to me, but I convinced myself it was just her being overly helpful, and I didn't want to start family drama over something that might have been nothing. I understood her position, and I didn't blame her for not wanting to get involved in what must have seemed like typical family tensions. But her experience taught me something important about how these kinds of systematic manipulations work. They rely on other people's reluctance to interfere, on the assumption that family members have good intentions, even when their behavior seems questionable. 6 months after the surgery that started this whole ordeal, I was sitting in my sunroom working on a watercolor painting of the gardens outside my window when my doorbell rang. The visitor was a woman about my age, well-dressed but with worried eyes, carrying a folder of papers and wearing the kind of expression I recognized from my own experience, the look of someone who knew something was wrong but didn't know how to name it or address it. "Mrs. Patterson," she said when I opened the door. "My name is Helen Morrison. I heard about your situation through a mutual friend at the senior center, and I wonder if I could ask your advice about something. My family is putting a lot of pressure on me to sell my house and move into assisted living, but something doesn't feel right about the way they're handling things." I invited Helen in for tea and spent the afternoon helping her understand what questions to ask, what warning signs to look for, and how to protect herself from well-meaning family members who might not actually have her best interests at heart. By the time she left, she had Elizabeth's business card, a clear plan for maintaining her independence, and the phone number for the Elder Abuse Hotline. That was the first of many such visits. Word spread somehow through the informal networks that older women use to share information and support each other, through the senior center, the library book clubs, the volunteer organizations where women my age stayed active and engaged with their communities. They came to ask about financial planning, about legal protection, about how to stand up to adult children who thought they knew better than their parents about what was best for them. I started holding informal workshops in my community center, teaching other women how to protect themselves from the kind of exploitation I'd experienced. We covered practical topics like how to organize financial records to prove competency, how to find trustworthy legal and financial advisors, how to recognize the warning signs of family members who might be positioning themselves to take advantage. But we also talked about the emotional aspects, how to maintain your sense of self-worth when people you love are treating you like you're incompetent, how to set boundaries with family members who've gotten used to making decisions for you, how to build a support network of people who see you as a whole person rather than a problem to be managed. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to steal my independence and treat me like an incompetent old woman, Matt and Olivia had actually given me a new purpose and a deeper understanding of my own strength. I'd spent my career teaching young people literature and writing, helping them find their voices and express themselves clearly. Now I was teaching women my own age how to use their voices to protect themselves and maintain their dignity in a world that too often assumes aging equals helplessness. There's something particularly satisfying about helping other women avoid the kind of betrayal I experienced, about watching them realize they don't have to accept being diminished or controlled just because they're getting older. Every workshop I teach, every conversation I have with a woman who's struggling with pushy family members or financial advisors who talk down to her, every success story I hear from someone who used the information I shared to protect herself, all of it feels like a form of justice, like turning my own bad experience into something that can help others. Sometimes, late in the evening, when I'm readings in my comfortable chair or putting the finishing touches on a painting, I think about the alternative life I might have lived if I'd been the helpless old woman they'd assumed I was. I think about waking up from this surgery to find my house sold, my possessions scattered, my financial independence stripped away by people who claimed to love me but had never bothered to see who I really was underneath their assumptions about age and capability. Instead, I wake up every morning in a home I chose for myself, surrounded by beauty I've created and neighbors who value my friendship and respect my autonomy. I have enough financial security to help other women protect themselves from the kind of betrayal that should never happen but happens far too often. I have art classes to teach and investments to manage, and a life that belongs entirely to me, shaped by my own choices rather than someone else's ideas about what's appropriate for a woman my age. The money that Matt and Olivia thought they could take from me, money I'd earned through decades of hard work, careful planning, and smart investing, is now funding scholarships for women who want to change their lives through education. It's supporting workshops that teach financial literacy and legal self-protection to older adults. It's creating exactly the kind of positive impact in the world that I want my life's work to represent. They thought they were stealing my house, but they were actually trying to steal something much more fundamental: my dignity, my autonomy, my right to make my own decisions about my own life. They failed completely, and in their failure, they taught me something invaluable about the importance of standing up for yourself, especially when the people you're standing up to are the ones you love most. In trying to make me powerless, they showed me just how powerful I really was. In trying to prove I was incompetent, they forced me to demonstrate my competence in ways that left no room for doubt. In trying to isolate me from my resources and support systems, they pushed me to build new networks of connection and mutual aid that are stronger and more meaningful than anything I'd had before. Every woman who attends one of my workshops, every person who calls the elder abuse hotline because of something I taught them to recognize, every family that learns to treat their older members with respect rather than condescension, all of it traces back to the moment when I decided I wasn't going to let my own family steal my life from me while I was unconscious on an operating table. The most important lesson I learned through this whole experience is that the assumptions people make about aging and capability are often just that: assumptions, not facts. Too many families, too many professionals, too many people in general assume that getting older automatically means becoming less competent, less deserving of respect, less capable of making sound decisions about your own life. But competence isn't determined by age. It's demonstrated by actions and results. Respect isn't something you lose when you turn 70. It's something you maintain by insisting on being treated with dignity. The right to make your own choices doesn't expire when you have surgery, or move into a smaller house, or start using a walking cane. It's a fundamental human right that belongs to you as long as you're mentally competent to exercise it. Matt and Olivia learned that lesson the hard way, and their criminal convictions will serve as a permanent reminder of what happens when you underestimate an older woman's intelligence, resources, and determination to protect herself. But more importantly, the women who attend my workshops are learning that lesson in a positive way, discovering that they have more power and more options than they might have realized. That's the real victory here. Not just that I protected myself from people who wanted to exploit me, but that I turned the experience into something that helps others protect themselves too. That's what justice looks like when you're 72 years old and refuse to be anyone's victim. Not just surviving the attempt to steal your independence, but using that survival to help others maintain theirs. Every morning when I wake up in my beautiful townhome, surrounded by the life I've chosen for myself, I'm reminded that age is just a number, that competence is proven by results, and that the most important battles you'll ever fight are the ones you fight for your own dignity and autonomy. Those are battles worth winning, no matter how old you are when you have to fight them.